So what kind of insights can we get from your data? First, let me show you what the data looks like. Here, I'm showing you flowering observations from magenta paintbrush collected in 2018 at plot 5 on the Reflection Lakes Trail. Time is along the x-axis, and days when volunteers hiked and observed the species flowering are marked with a yes, and days when volunteers hiked and didn't see any magenta paintbrush flowering are marked with a no. So each colored dot represents one hiker making an observation on one day. For example, a group of volunteers that hiked in early August and did not see the flowering phase of magenta paintbrush in plot 5 on Reflection Lakes is represented by a data point here. So we can look at these dots and see that magenta paintbrush was first observed flowering in mid-June and flowered all the way until early August. But we can also use statistical models to fit a curve to that data, describing the probability that you would see magenta paintbrush flowering at any point in time. Here is that curve. That curve can also tell us when volunteers would have the best chance to see flowering of magenta paintbrush at that plot. And that is on July 12, 2018. In other words, peak flowering for magenta paintbrush occurred at plot 5 around mid-July. So we can use these kinds of curves and fit them to all the data from all the phenophases and use it to answer questions like, how long does the whole process of plant reproduction takes? Here, for example, are the phenology curves for glacier lily budding, flowering, fruiting, and setting seed in one of our glacier basin plots in 2018. If you look at when the peaks of those phenophase curves occur, you can see that it takes more than half of the snow-free period in summer, from June until late August, for this species to complete its reproductive cycle, to go all the way from producing flowers to all the way to setting seed. We can also use this data in combination with the information on when snow melted at these plots to ask whether the timing of reproduction is driven by snow melt. For example, we know that snowmelt in this plot in this year occurred on June 25th, 2018. We can compare that date collected from each plot to the date of peak flowering, for example, at each plot to ask whether later snowmelt leads to later flowering or later production of buds, fruits, or seeds. Here is that data plotted for Sitka valerian. What you can see on the x-axis are the estimates of snowmelt dates from our microclimate sensors, and on the y-axis are the dates of peak flowering for Sitka valerian, so the place on those phenological curves where flowering was maximum. So each gray dot represents those estimates from a plot year and year combination for this species. Hopefully, you are as convinced as we are and as statistics show us that earlier snowmelt invariably leads to earlier flowering for Sitka valerian, as demonstrated by the best fit line in gray. So we can fit these curves for all of our focal species, and we can also ask whether these responses differ by species. In other words, what I'm showing you here is that Sitka valerian flowers earlier when snow melts earlier. But is this also the case for all of our other focal species? So in other words, do species differ in their responses to snowmelt? The answer to this question is partly yes, as demonstrated by this graph. Here are the lines that represent the relationship between the date of snowmelt, which is on the x-axis, and the timing of peak flowering, which is on the y-axis, for the species that you would see on the Glacier Basin Trail. Each line represents a different species, and those lines were fit to all the plot year combinations that you have collected over the last 6 or so years. So I want you to notice two things. First, all of the lines here show that when snow melts earlier, flowering also occurs earlier. So in this way, species responses are consistent. Earlier snowmelt, as we expect with climate change, we predict will cause all of these wildflower species to flower earlier. However, hopefully you can also see that those lines differ in their slopes. This means that the sensitivity of these wildflower species to changes in snowmelt differs. In other words, as snow melts earlier, some species will shift their flowering more than others. And you can see that because a lot of these lines cross. Another way to think about it is that the order in which species flower depends a lot on the timing of snowmelt. And we also know from other data collected by my lab that climatic factors besides snow, like how warm a flowering season is and how wet it is, also influence the relative timing in which species flower. So although we expect all of the species to shift their phenology earlier with earlier snowmelt, such as we expect with climate change, we would expect those shifts to differ among species. You can see here how climate influences both the timing and composition of flowering communities when looking at the flowering curves for 4 common species on the Glacier Basin Trail in 3 different years. Plotted here on the x-axis is time, and the flowering curves for all of the different plots in which these species were observed in each year. Shown here are glacier lily in the yellow lines, scarlet paintbrush in orange, lupin in purple, and cascade aster in pink lines. The top panel shows all those curves in 2015, which was a historically early snowmelt year. For reference, snowmelt occurred at around late April to early May in our lowest elevation plot, which was a full month before snow melts on average at that location in more average years, such as 2018 and 2019. You can also see that in 2015, all species uniformly flowered earlier, these 4 species in plots, than they did in the 2 other years. So all of those curves are shifted to the left. But you can also see that the order in which the different species bloomed varied a little in the 3 years. For example, in 2015 and 2018, cascade aster, which is represented by the pink lines, flowered later than lupin and scarlet paintbrush. In 2019, however, these 3 species more or less overlapped in their flowering time.
Here are some more interesting trends from a recently published paper showing that similar connection between snowmelt and flowering phenology. For both Glacier Basin and Reflection Lakes trails, you can see that we've now aggregated peak flowering for all of our focal species and divided them by year, with lighter dots representing years of earlier snowmelt and darker dots representing later snowmelt. This is another great way to visualize how the timing of peak flowering is variable and heavily reliant on the timing of snowmelt each year. This study also looked at visitors and visitor satisfaction to the park, and found that visitation to the park, the graph on the lower left here, remains similar across different years, regardless of snowmelt or timing of peak flowering. So what could this mean? It's likely that in future years, as flowering becomes earlier and visitation remains the same, we could see a decrease in overall satisfaction of visitors coming to the park to see these floral displays due to a social ecological mismatch. You may also be wondering how volunteer-collected data might compare to scientist-collected data, and the answer is our volunteers are great at monitoring phenology, collecting data at an accuracy quite comparable to trained scientists. By adding up the gray squares here in these confusion matrices, we can see that volunteers predict flowering, for example, with an 89.7% average accuracy.
So to summarize, your data have demonstrated that snow plays an important role in controlling the timing of flowering and fruit production in the system. This means that climate change will shift the wildflower season earlier. Your data have also demonstrated that despite the fact that all the species we have studied are sensitive to snowmelt, they also do differ in their responses. And this implies that the composition of the wildflower community will also be affected, with the possibility of some species that used to co-flower not doing so in a warmer, less snowy world, and other groups of species that never used to overlap in their flowering, potentially doing so in the future. The implications for both of these changes in the wildflower season for interactions between wildflowers and other organisms, for example, pollinators, fruit eaters, and even us visitors, remains unclear and is the topic of future work.